These weren't simple bookkeeping errors. Their trusted accountants were running elaborate criminal enterprises, using star clients' money to fund unlawful operations while filing fake tax returns that would eventually cause the ruin of their victims' existence. Judy Garland, The Price of Perpetual Debt. Despite earning what would be millions today for The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland's net worth remained perpetually near zero. This paradox was not due to extravagant spending, but because her trusted manager was running a system that guaranteed her downfall. Judy Garland was the voice of a generation, the embodiment of American hope and talent, yet she lived much of her adult life under the crippling weight of financial insecurity. From the moment she soared to fame in the late 1930s, her income was astronomical, but her net worth remained perpetually near zero. This paradox was the direct result of systematic financial mismanagement by those closest to her, beginning with her early years under the strict control of the studio system, which instilled a dependency that unscrupulous managers would later exploit. The seeds of Judy's vulnerability were sown during her time as a teenage contract player for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The studio system, though providing her with fame and enormous income potential, simultaneously stripped her of basic financial autonomy and literacy. As a minor, and even well into her early 20s, her earnings were controlled by MGM and then passed to guardians and business managers who prioritized the studio's interests and control over her long-term wealth building. She was paid a salary, but had virtually no control over the management of that salary, creating a deep-seated reliance on external figures to handle her finances. This early period was crucial, as it established a pattern of handing over absolute financial authority to men she was conditioned to trust. Once released from the studio's iron grip, she lacked the experience and knowledge to discern competent, ethical financial counsel from predatory opportunists. Judy's managers, often claiming to act as trusted guardians of her career, saw her massive potential earnings as a continuous faucet to fund their own schemes. They operated by keeping her in a state of perpetual need for immediate liquidity. The core criminal strategy employed was the cycling of high-interest loans, a sophisticated form of usury and self-dealing. The manager would identify a genuine, urgent need, perhaps a looming tax deadline or a critical legal fee, and then arrange a massive loan, perhaps $25,000, the equivalent of over $400,000 today, ostensibly to pay an immediate tax bill or clear an old debt. However, a massive portion of this money, a huge commission, sometimes half the loan amount, would go immediately back to the manager or his shell company as an arrangement fee or risk premium. This maneuver was devastatingly effective. Judy only received a fraction of the capital, yet she was responsible for repaying the entire principal, plus an exorbitant, often undisclosed, interest rate. This immediate debt, coupled with the exorbitant interest, instantly placed her in a massive financial hole. To service this manufactured debt, she was forced to sign on for another film, another recording session, or another grueling stretch of concerts, ensuring she was constantly working for interest payments rather than her own profit. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Her exhaustion would lead to professional and personal crises, which the manager would then claim required another emergency loan with another massive commission. Furthermore, many of her legitimate expenses, such as payments to household staff, property maintenance, and medical bills, were deliberately left unpaid or paid late by the managers. They would actively withhold funds, making her financial state appear worse than it was, thus creating a continuous cycle of urgent crises, eviction notices, lawsuits, or threats of seizure that only the manager could supposedly solve with another high-interest advance. The true devastation was psychological. This relentless financial pressure fueled the instability that plagued her life. Her reliance on prescribed pills and alcohol to cope with the exhaustion was a direct consequence of a schedule manufactured by men who benefited from her desperation and constant need for work. She was performing under the dual duress of a crushing work schedule and constant, unnecessary fear of destitution. She would perform to packed houses, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet wake up the next day, facing eviction notices or seizure warrants due to unpaid bills the manager had concealed. This vulnerability made her an easy mark. She trusted the men who promised order and financial stability, only to be betrayed again and again. Her inability to find firm footing financially contributed greatly to the personal anguish that followed her throughout her career. By the time she passed away in 1969, she had left behind a complex legal tangle rather than a legacy of wealth, a heartbreaking irony for one of the world's most successful entertainers whose total lifetime earnings were estimated to be well into the tens of millions of dollars. Her tragedy remains the defining example of a star whose immense talent was exploited to fund the avarice of those closest to her. Errol Flynn, the yacht, and the Phantom Corporation. But Garland's theft was only the beginning. The schemes grew bolder, extending even beyond America's borders. From the musical sound stages to the high seas and complex international finance, the next star to be fleeced had his wealth anchored in offshore deception. Errol Flynn was the quintessential cinematic swashbuckler, living a life of breathtaking abandon, complete with parties, beautiful women, and, most famously, his luxury yacht, the Zaka. This extravagant, hedonistic lifestyle was not just permitted by his business manager, it was actively financed and complicated by him through methods that led directly to Flynn's financial undoing. Flynn's manager created a vast, complex offshore phantom corporation designed specifically to help the star legally avoid paying the steep United States taxes on his substantial income, which routinely placed him in the highest tax bracket. This scheme was initially presented as shrewd financial planning, a popular tactic among high-earning stars in the post-World War II era, but it swiftly devolved into outright criminal fraud. The manager funneled millions through intricate foreign accounts and holding companies, exaggerating business expenses, creating shell accounts, and completely misrepresenting Flynn's tax residency by claiming he spent more time outside the U.S. than he actually did. The moment the United States government began to investigate, they did not just find simple errors. They uncovered a deliberate web of deceit and outright tax evasion on a massive scale. The government successfully seized the entire assets of the Phantom Corporation, resulting in a crushing tax liability and debt that effectively wiped out Flynn's true liquid worth, a sum estimated to be close to $5 million at the time of the investigation. The star's glamorous facade crumbled as he faced crippling tax demands in his final years. He was forced to sell beloved possessions, including the Zaka, his home, and his private island, to stave off complete insolvency. The man who sailed the world's oceans like a king passed away financially ruined in 1959, leaving his heirs with little but massive liabilities and a decades-long legal battle with the Internal Revenue Service. His manager's deception was a high-stakes gamble against the government, and the star paid the ultimate price. The glamorous veneer of his daring existence had been nothing more than a front for an accountant's reckless and high-stakes crime. Mae West, the tight-fisted fortune and the wiped-out cash. The irony is perhaps greatest with our next subject, a star famous for her shrewd, tight-fisted control over her own money. Mae West was not foolish with her cash. In fact, she was notoriously cautious and known for her reluctance to spend a dime more than necessary. She made a fortune writing, producing, and starring in plays and films, and she wanted to keep every penny of it, preferring to hoard cash and keep assets in secure, unmoving forms. This very quality, her deep-seated desire to avoid taxation, which she viewed as a form of theft, made her a perfect target for an accountant whose schemes were as bold as West herself. West's financial advisor convinced her to engage in extremely aggressive tax avoidance schemes, promising a method that would legally shield virtually all of her significant liquid assets. The crime was not simple embezzlement, but rather the filing of overly complicated, fraudulent tax returns designed to hide a massive amount of liquid cash from the government. The manager's goal was to make her look far less profitable than she was, sometimes claiming fictitious losses or diverting income through non-existent trusts, ensuring she paid virtually no income tax. When the Internal Revenue Service finally audited her, they did not find a desperate actress struggling to pay bills. They found deliberate and audacious misrepresentation of millions of dollars of income over several years. The government immediately levied an enormous penalty, a sum so large and so immediate that it wiped out her substantial cash reserves. Despite her considerable property holdings and continuing residual income, the sudden demand for payment in the form of back taxes and severe fraud penalties left her financially crippled, unable to access the very money she had worked so hard to save and hide. Mae West had managed to escape the poverty of her youth, only to see her self-made fortune nearly vanish due to the greed of a man who promised to make her richer. Her inherent suspicion of everyone was finally validated, but it came too late. The sophisticated fraud intended to make her a multi-millionaire tax dodger instead left her scrambling to pay her bills and facing years of complex litigation to stave off the sale of her precious real estate holdings. Humphrey Bogart, The Silent Partners Double Books. The tough guy persona of our next star masked a terrifying vulnerability to his trusted business partners. Humphrey Bogart was the picture of cynical competence on screen, a man who couldn't be fooled. Yet, in real life, his faith in a trusted business manager was profoundly abused, nearly resulting in his implication in organized criminal activities. Bogart, toward the height of his fame, formed a small, private production company, like many top stars of the era, to manage his lucrative film deals and residual earnings, and he handed the keys to this company to a man he believed was a friend and expert financier. This manager saw the star's production company as a secure and easily laundered revenue stream, protected by the star's unimpeachable public image. The crime was operating through double books. On one set of ledgers, the manager logged legitimate film expenses and payments, which were available for any audit. On the second, hidden set of books, he was systematically siphoning off vast sums of the company's budget to invest in unlawful side ventures, including financing underground gambling dens and unlicensed liquor operations in California, particularly around the thriving studio areas. These were not just bad investments, they were organized criminal enterprises, and they were all linked back to Bogart's production company through convoluted paper trails. When the unlawful operations were eventually raided and investigated by local and federal authorities, they traced the funding back to the production company, putting Bogart's name and reputation directly on the line. The potential for reputational destruction was immense. The studio system, though powerful, could not protect a star against the charge of funding criminal activities, a scandal that could have ended his career. Though Bogart was ultimately cleared of any knowledge or intentional wrongdoing after a lengthy investigation, the manager's actions nearly destroyed the unimpeachable integrity of the star's public image, leaving him with a significant financial mess from having to cover the losses of the unlawful ventures and a chilling realization. The man he trusted had used his good name and his production company's capital as a shield for illicit, life-ending operations. Bette Davis, the missing millions of the Legacy Trust. The betrayal our next legend faced was not just of her present wealth, but of the entire future she planned for her children. Bette Davis, known for her ferocious dedication to her career and her often turbulent family life, sought to establish a lasting financial legacy for her children, a secure fund that would sustain them long after she was gone. She enlisted a reputable-sounding manager to create a sophisticated legacy trust, specifically intended to hold all her future royalties, real estate holdings, and residual income from her extensive filmography. She viewed this trust as the ultimate safeguard against the unpredictable nature of show business earnings. This manager's scheme was perhaps the most calculatedly cruel, systematic, long-term theft disguised as financial prudence. He convinced Davis to put the vast majority of her disposable wealth and assets into the trust, claiming it was protected and untouchable by creditors or her ex-husbands. Once the principal was secured, he began quietly looting the principal over a period of more than 10 years. He used fraudulent accounting methods, creating fake loans from the trust to phantom entities and deliberately overcharging for management fees that went directly into his own accounts, all while providing Davis with carefully doctored quarterly statements. Davis only discovered the extent of the betrayal when her children sought to access funds in the early 1960s, finding the trust almost completely empty. The millions she had painstakingly earned, the future she had secured for her family, had vanished, reduced to negligible sums. The emotional fallout was catastrophic. Davis had fought relentlessly for her professional control with the studios, only to be utterly betrayed in her most personal role as a mother trying to provide for her heirs. This systematic destruction of her family legacy was a betrayal that wounded her more deeply than any professional feud or scandal, forcing her to work well into her later years to attempt to recoup the lost principal. Mickey Rooney, the boy who was stolen from twice. The story of Hollywood exploitation is sadly synonymous with the boy who never grew up on screen, but was fleeced mercilessly off it. Mickey Rooney's financial biography is a sorrowful cycle of being robbed, recovering, and then being robbed again. His vulnerability stemmed from his reliance on managers after the studio system. Specifically, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released its iron grip on his finances and his life. He was famous, but ill-equipped to handle the complexities of personal wealth, having worked almost continuously since he was a small child and never learning basic financial literacy. Rooney's manager after the late 1940s saw the star's constant need for money, coupled with his difficulty saying no and his string of expensive marriages and divorces, as an unending opportunity for plunder. The specific technique was the exploitation of his chronic reliance. The manager would act as Rooney's sole contact with the outside world, controlling his bank accounts, paying his bills, and receiving his income. He controlled Rooney's mail, his appointments, and his access to potential saviors, creating a financial bubble. Because Rooney always seemed to be chasing a comeback or struggling with personal issues, the manager simply funneled off cash at every turn, inflated personal expenses, secret commissions on low-paying engagements, and outright fraudulent withdrawals from his principal. The money was removed in small, continuous amounts, making it difficult to detect. Rooney found himself destitute multiple times, often reduced to taking any role available just to survive and cover immediate needs. The most painful aspect was the repeated and chronic exploitation. He would fire one manager after discovering theft, only to hire another who used the exact same methods, recognizing the instability of the star as their greatest asset. The man who had been one of the biggest box office draws in the 1930s and 1940s spent much of his later life battling for financial solvency and personal stability, a profound injustice committed by those he trusted to care for him and his considerable earnings. His total lifetime losses to various unscrupulous managers and advisors were estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars. Lana Turner, the jewelry, the loans, and the liquidated life. Our next star learned that the glamour she projected was the very collateral used against her, turning her most iconic possessions into burdens of debt. Lana Turner was the image of polished, blonde sophistication, surrounding herself with the trappings of Hollywood royalty, stunning mansions, furs, and, most famously, spectacular jewelry. But her business manager saw this glittering facade not as assets to be preserved, but as pure, liquid equity to be exploited for his immediate gain. The manager's crime was highly aggressive and physical. He coerced Turner into taking out massive, high-interest loans against her personal property and high-value physical assets, especially her renowned diamond collection. Using fraudulent documentation and high-pressure tactics, he claimed the loans were needed for necessary tax payments or critical investments with fast returns. Turner, trusting his financial expertise, signed the paperwork, believing her assets were safe and the loans were temporary. The manager then pocketed the full loan amount, often tens of thousands of dollars at a time, leaving her with crippling, unserviceable debt. The interest rates were usurious, and the principal was never repaid by the manager. The inevitable followed. When the notes came due, the collection agencies arrived. Turner faced the humiliation of having her homes, luxury vehicles, and cherished personal possessions, the very things that defined her public image, seized and liquidated at a fraction of their value. She was left with nothing but the crushing debt, a searing financial wound that haunted her for years. The physical loss of these possessions was agonizing, but the deeper betrayal was the way her manager used her public glamour against her, treating her life's acquisitions as disposable collateral for his own nefarious profit, systematically stripping away the material symbols of her success. Cary Grant, the shell companies of the studio era. Even the polished, debonair charm of Cary Grant was not enough to ward off the schemes of a man who preyed on his immense public trust. Cary Grant embodied elegance, stability, and financial success. He was one of the few stars who genuinely gained financial independence outside the studio system in the 1950s, giving him a reputation for being shrewd and business-savvy. This immaculate public credit, however, became the perfect weapon for a crooked advisor seeking to leverage that trust for his own gain. The manager's strategy was sophisticated and difficult to trace, the establishment of multiple shell companies using Grant's name and credit as the sole backing. The manager would secure large commercial loans, ostensibly for future film development or property acquisitions, related to Grant's career, leveraging Grant's immense public trust and credit history as collateral. The loan money would go immediately into the shell company, which the manager controlled entirely, before being laundered out into the manager's private accounts through fraudulent invoices and transfers. Grant received virtually none of the loan proceeds, but since his name was attached as a guarantor or principal in the shell corporation structure, he was left with crippling liabilities when the manager allowed the shell companies to default. The star, who had worked so hard to achieve financial autonomy, found himself fighting a continuous battle against creditors seeking repayment for debts he never benefited from. The abuse of his good name was the ultimate betrayal. The man who seemed untouchable was financially shackled by the quiet, bureaucratic fraud of a trusted fiduciary who recognized that Grant's spotless reputation was the most valuable asset he possessed, an asset that could be sold for cash. Elizabeth Taylor, The Diamond and the Hidden Offshore Account. The great love stories of our next star were always epic, but the trust she placed in her early financial advisor led to an epic disappearance of wealth. Elizabeth Taylor earned massive salaries from childhood, beginning with National Velvet. As a minor and then a young adult, her immense wealth was controlled by a trusted family friend business manager. The trust placed in this individual was absolute, as her parents believed he was the most qualified person to handle the complex finances of a rapidly growing child star. The crime was simple, effective, and had a heartbreaking conclusion. The manager systematically diverted a vast sum of Taylor's early career earnings, estimated to be well over $1 million, from her early Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer contracts into a complex, hidden, offshore account in a non-extradition country. Taylor was simply told the money was invested securely in a long-term fund. The theft was so well disguised, with fake accounting records and fabricated statements, that the star remained unaware for decades, believing her assets were in order and growing. The truth of the theft only emerged after the manager passed away suddenly. Upon the manager's passing, Taylor's new accountants attempted to reconcile her total assets and discovered the massive, unauthorized offshore account and the missing principal. The money had been set up to benefit the manager's own family. But the complex legal structure and the passing of the only person who knew the passwords and details meant the assets effectively vanished into a legal black hole. Taylor spent years fighting international legal battles to recover what was rightfully hers, a profound loss amplified by the fact that the only person who could explain the betrayal was gone forever. It was the ultimate crime that ended with the criminal, leaving the victim with no clear path to justice or recovery. Gary Cooper, The Faked Investment in the Lost Film. This rugged embodiment of American integrity was taken advantage of by a manager who exploited the era's sentimentality. Gary Cooper, the quintessential American hero, was a man of quiet honor and deep artistic appreciation, but his business manager appealed directly to his sense of history and legacy to facilitate a massive fraud. Cooper was known for a reserved but genuine interest in the history of cinema. The manager's fabrication centered on an emotional appeal, a supposed opportunity to finance the restoration and re-release of a lost, silent film masterpiece from the 1920s, claiming it was a crucial piece of film history. Cooper, a great admirer of early cinema and its legends, was an easy mark. The manager provided detailed, compelling documents that fabricated the existence of the film and its enormous potential for profit upon re-release, extracting massive sums, sometimes over $100,000 in a single transaction from the star, for restoration costs, rights acquisition, and archival storage fees. In reality, the film did not exist, and the supposed contracts were completely fraudulent. The money was used entirely for the manager's own substantial real estate purchases, including a luxury home, while Cooper was left with fake contracts and fictitious ledgers. The emotional sting of the fraud was intense. The manager had exploited Cooper's romantic nostalgia for the cinema he loved. When the scam was uncovered, Cooper was not just financially poorer, he was deeply disillusioned, having been victimized by a scheme that preyed upon his most heartfelt connection to the very art form he championed. Rita Hayworth, The Management That Wiped Out a Dynasty. Our next star's emotional life was already chaotic, a vulnerability a cruel financial manager expertly used to complete her ruin. Rita Hayworth, the definitive American love goddess, endured a life marked by emotional turmoil, multiple failed marriages to high-profile figures, and complex, expensive legal battles over divorces and custody. This personal and emotional chaos, which required constant attention and massive legal fees, made her finances an open target for a deceitful advisor. Hayworth's manager recognized that the continuous financial drain of her high-profile divorce settlements and custody battles created an environment where detailed accounting would be overlooked. The manager ruthlessly exploited this chaos by consistently overbilling and double-charging for every service, and systematically diverting her film royalty payments, sometimes removing a cut of up to 20% more than his agreed-upon commission. The complexity of her legal life acted as a perfect smokescreen, as all focus was on the immediate legal challenges. The manager also failed to file critical paperwork regarding her royalty streams, allowing valuable income to lapse or become tied up in legal limbo, often by missing filing deadlines headlines for foreign royalty claims. Hayworth's immense wealth, earned from iconic films like Gilda, was not just spent on lavish living, it was systematically siphoned away by the man tasked with preserving it during her most challenging years. By the 1960s, the woman who had captivated the world was financially destitute, her massive fortune wiped out not just by costly divorces, but by the relentless, quiet theft and administrative malpractice of her manager. Tony Curtis, the missing pension and the IRS audit. The vibrant optimism of this versatile leading man was shattered when his retirement security was wiped away by a quiet, bureaucratic deceit. Tony Curtis, known for his energy and charm in films like Some Like It Hot, spent decades in Hollywood, assuming his professional team was securing his future through standard industry practices. But the betrayal he faced struck at the very foundation of his security, his long-term financial stability and retirement savings. The systematic crime committed by Curtis's manager was one of quiet, bureaucratic devastation. The manager failed to file mandatory pension contributions and withholdings on the star's behalf for several years, diverting the cash directly to himself. Even worse, to hide this massive deficit, the manager forged Internal Revenue Service documentation, claiming the payments were current and the funds secured in the appropriate retirement vehicles, thus preventing the star from seeing any red flags. When the massive deficit was finally exposed during a routine audit of his business accounts, the Internal Revenue Service levied enormous penalties and fees for the non-payment of required contributions. Curtis, upon reaching an age where he should have been enjoying a comfortable retirement, found that the supposed millions in his pension fund were non-existent and that he was facing a significant personal tax liability that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. The destruction of his long-term security was complete. His manager's actions turned his carefully planned retirement into a financial scramble, a cruel fate for a man who had dedicated his life to entertaining millions. Dorothy Dandridge, the exploitation of an icon's trust. As an icon who broke barriers, our next star faced unique isolation, making her an easy and tragic target for a villainous advisor. Dorothy Dandridge was a pioneer, the first African-American woman nominated for a Best Actress Academy Award for Carmen Jones. But her groundbreaking status meant she often operated outside the mainstream Hollywood power structures and networks, leaving her vulnerable to unscrupulous advisors who preyed on her relative isolation and lack of industry connections for financial protection. Dandridge's life was shadowed by the lifelong care required for her severely brain-damaged daughter, Marilyn. This immense financial responsibility became the focus of her manager's most despicable crime, the theft from her daughter's trust fund, which was established for medical and institutional care. The manager knew Dandridge's primary motivation was her child's welfare, and he used this love against her. He systematically diverted funds set aside for Marilyn's institutional care and lifelong needs, often submitting fake invoices for services that were never rendered or grossly inflating the cost of her necessary care. The exploitation was twofold. It was financial, systematically stripping her of her savings, but it also added an unbearable emotional burden to a woman already struggling against the racial prejudice and professional limitations of the era. The manager's theft contributed directly to Dandridge's financial ruin and subsequent emotional collapse, ensuring the woman who fought so hard for dignity on screen passed away alone and in poverty in 1965, leaving her daughter's future tragically insecure. Spencer Tracy, the charity fraud and the shadow ledger. The final irony is that our next star's most noble legacy was almost completely ruined by the very man trusted to protect his personal and financial life. Spencer Tracy, known for his moral fortitude on screen, used his private life to support an extraordinary cause. The John Tracy Clinic, founded by his wife Louise to help deaf children, inspired by their son, John. This clinic was a source of light and redemption for the famously troubled actor and his wife. Tracy's manager, however, saw the clinic's legitimate operation as the perfect cover for a massive charity fraud. The manager set up a network of fake charity shell corporations to launder money, cleverly mixing them with the genuine clinic's accounts. Funds, ostensibly donated to the real clinic, which Tracy and his powerful friends raised through high-profile events, were diverted into the shell organizations controlled by the manager, who then used the money for personal investments and expenses. When authorities finally investigated the web of fraud, the resulting scandal created an existential crisis for the genuine John Tracy Clinic. Its reputation was nearly ruined, and its funding collapsed as donors feared they were contributing to a criminal operation, forcing an emergency overhaul of its entire financial structure. The man Spencer Tracy trusted not only took his money but nearly destroyed his greatest personal legacy, causing immense moral and ethical damage to a noble institution that was helping thousands of families, a betrayal that deeply wounded the fiercely private Tracy. Jane Russell, the Hollywood hustle that vanished her savings. Our next star was promised a future anchored in stable assets, only to see her decades of savings vanish in a series of fraudulent promises. Jane Russell, the stunning star of films like The Outlaw, had a substantial fortune by the 1950s, largely due to her immense popularity and savvy self-management outside the major studio control. Seeking security for her family and her future, she entrusted her wealth to a financial manager who specialized in exploiting the post-war investment boom in California. The manager's hustle was to convince Russell to move her stable, liquid savings from secure bonds and treasury notes into highly speculative, fraudulent Hollywood real estate development schemes. He painted a glamorous picture of enormous, quick returns from new subdivisions, commercial properties, and shopping centers in the rapidly expanding Los Angeles area. In reality, these schemes were merely a Ponzi scheme. New investor money was used to pay fake returns to old investors, and the core money was funneled directly to the manager who used the star's investment as a base for his personal operations. Russell lost the vast majority of her disposable income, a sum that totaled in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her manager had preyed on the era's optimism and her faith in local business development, leaving her with worthless contracts and land deeds for developments that never materialized or were legally unsound. The consequence was severe, forcing her to dramatically scale back her life and focus on stage and television work well into the 1960s to rebuild the fortune that had been carelessly evaporated by an opportunistic crook who exploited the glamour surrounding new ventures. Tyrone Power, the life insurance policy that paid no one. The handsome star's early tragic passing revealed a heartbreaking deception that victimized his family long after he was gone. Tyrone Power was one of the greatest matinee idols, and his unexpected passing in 1958, at the age of 44, from a heart attack on a film set, was a profound shock to the world. He believed he had planned meticulously for the security of his young wife and children, primarily through a massive guaranteed life insurance policy, a common safeguard for high-risk, high-income professionals. The manager's crime was simple, continuous, and catastrophic. He had been pocketing the substantial premiums for the massive life insurance policy for years. Instead of sending the substantial quarterly or annual payments to the insurance company, the manager forged receipts and internal company documentation to show the policy was current and kept the cash for himself. Power, busy filming internationally and trusting his financial team implicitly, never questioned the details of a routine payment. Upon Power's sudden passing, his widow submitted the claim, only to receive the devastating news. The policy had lapsed years earlier due to non-payment. The immense security Power had intended for his family vanished overnight, leaving them with nothing but the manager's staggering betrayal. The funds Power had meticulously planned for his children's education, $500,000 in coverage, a massive sum for the era, were simply gone. The manager's actions turned a personal tragedy into a catastrophic financial crisis for the surviving family, a betrayal that only became clear when the star was no longer in existence to fight it or enforce his wishes. Clara Bow, the accountant who tried to blackmail the it girl. The trauma of her poverty-stricken past resurfaced when her accountant weaponized her own private vulnerabilities against her. Clara Bow, the original it girl, carried the scars of a severely troubled youth and the intense pressures of early Hollywood stardom, which contributed to periods of extreme mental health fragility and the need for private institutional care. This vulnerability, coupled with her immense wealth from a wildly successful but brief film career, made her a prime target. Bow's manager's crime was not just theft, though he certainly took large sums through overcharging and fraudulent expenses on her personal accounts. His most egregious act was the subsequent attempted blackmail when Bow finally began questioning the finances and expressing distrust. The manager had meticulously kept records and copies of sensitive details regarding Bow's fragile mental state, her periods of hospitalization, and salacious, private aspects of her personal life, from her tumultuous past, creating a physical insurance policy against discovery. When Bow, in a moment of clarity and growing suspicion, challenged the manager's accounting, he retaliated by threatening to release these private and deeply humiliating documents to the press, leveraging her fear of public humiliation and institutionalization against her. This emotional and psychological manipulation was deeply damaging, forcing her to temporarily back down and fear for her sanity. While the blackmail attempt ultimately failed due to intervention, it demonstrated the shocking cruelty of a man who was willing to destroy his client's fragile peace of mind to protect his financial crimes. Tierney, the ruined health and the fake medical expenses. Our next star endured unspeakable personal tragedy, a time of vulnerability ruthlessly exploited by a man who should have been her most steadfast protector. Tierney, whose life was marked by the tragic consequence of contracting rubella during pregnancy, suffered deep guilt and subsequent severe mental health struggles, requiring several extended periods in psychiatric institutions for treatment in the 1950s. This left her completely isolated from the outside world and her financial affairs. This period of extreme incapacity became the manager's great opportunity. The crime was a calculated act of plunder. The manager filed massive, fraudulent medical and institutional expenses against her accounts. He fabricated costs for treatments, professional staff, and residency that were grossly inflated or completely non-existent, pocketing the difference. He took advantage of the difficulty in auditing such sensitive, closed-door institutional costs. Tierney, during her hospitalization and long recovery, was completely unable to monitor her own finances or challenge the charges, relying completely on the manager's supposed competence. The manager systematically drained her accounts while she was at her most vulnerable, stripping her of the financial cushion she needed for long-term health management. The discovery of this theft years later, which amounted to a significant portion of her liquid wealth, added another layer of devastating betrayal to an already heartbreaking life. It was a cruel reminder that even during her darkest hours, there were those who saw her only as a source of money to be exploited. Rock Hudson, the faked investments in his own real estate. The man who fought so hard to keep his true life hidden was brought to the brink of ruin by a manager who made him invest in thin air. Rock Hudson lived much of his professional life under immense pressure, maintaining a non-homosexual persona to protect his career and his multi-million-dollar status as a leading man. The stress of this double life, combined with his trusting nature and need for a reliable inner circle, made him a victim of a sophisticated financial shell game. Hudson's manager's crime was an intricate fraud involving the star's personal properties and assets. The manager convinced Hudson to personally invest enormous sums into several pieces of real estate that the manager already secretly owned and were in financial distress. He grossly inflated the value of these properties, fabricating market reports and potential returns, making them seem like lucrative investment opportunities to the star. The cash Hudson provided was simply the manager's personal profit, allowing him to offload his failing properties onto the star. The manager then intentionally defaulted on the mortgages on these overvalued properties, sometimes within months of the transaction. Because Hudson was the primary investor, he was left to shoulder the massive debt and the financial collapse when the properties were foreclosed upon, having essentially bought his own stolen money back in a convoluted scheme to prop up the manager's failing personal portfolio. The collapse left Hudson with massive liabilities and a deep sense of humiliation, forcing him to continue working long past the point of exhaustion to cover the debts and save his remaining assets. Gable, the manager who sold the dream house. The ultimate king of Hollywood lost not only his fortune but his most cherished place of peace because of an unchecked power of attorney. Gable, who reigned over Hollywood for decades, owned a beloved ranch property, his sanctuary, where he retreated from the pressures of fame, especially after the passing of Carole Lombard. He entrusted his financial affairs and a broad, sweeping power of attorney to a trusted manager for ease of transaction while he was on location. The manager's crime was the secret, methodical dismantling of Gable's private world. While Gable was busy on grueling film shoots or overseas for extended periods, the manager began secretly selling off parcels of his valuable ranch property piece by piece to various developers and buyers, utilizing the star's power of attorney. Gable was led to believe the land sales were minor or routine, perhaps for tax purposes or marginal utility. When Gable returned and took stock of his property, he discovered that he was left with only the main house and a fraction of the original hundreds of acres of land he cherished. The manager had taken the cash from the multiple sales and left Gable with the subsequent massive massive, undeclared capital gains tax liability from the undeclared sales, which he hadn't prepared for. The physical loss of his personal sanctuary and farm, which he viewed as his greatest personal asset, was an emotional blow that hurt Gable more than the loss of the money. He had sacrificed his work and life for these properties, only to have the manager's single signature steal his peace. Marilyn Monroe, the final unfiled return, and the tragic tangle. We end with a story of final, devastating administrative chaos, the last betrayal of a star already gone too soon. Marilyn Monroe's life was marked by financial and emotional instability, especially in her final years as she fought for creative control and better contracts. Her final months were fraught with professional and personal crisis, leaving her financial affairs in a deeply complex and unfinished state. The final crime was one of opportunistic negligence and betrayal. At the time of her passing, in 1962, an unscrupulous manager had failed to file her final, complex tax returns for the previous few years. Her income sources were varied, her expenses disputed, and her assets tangled in multiple holding corporations and contractual agreements with studios. The manager's failure to complete this essential administrative task, possibly to hide previous misappropriations, left her estate in a crippling, multi-year legal battle with the Internal Revenue Service. The financial confusion postponed the distribution of her estate for years, preventing the final peace and resolution she deserved and delaying the bequests to her chosen beneficiaries, including the Lee Strasbergs and her charity of choice. The chaotic, drawn-out process meant the assets intended for her beneficiaries were consumed by legal fees, penalties, and interest charges. Even in passing, she was not safe from the financial chaos created by opportunistic individuals who saw her as a cash machine rather than a human being. It was the final, tragic tangle that ensured her financial legacy was one of unresolved litigation. These 21 stories represent the chilling parallel narrative of Hollywood's golden age. For every dream projected onto the silver screen, there was a quiet, destructive nightmare unfolding in the private offices of trusted advisors. These stars, who commanded millions of dollars and billions of dreams, were often reduced to children when facing the complex realities of wealth management. They placed their absolute faith in individuals who saw their trust not as a responsibility, but as an opportunity for grand larceny. The sheer scale of the betrayal is staggering. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to these icons was rarely a jealous rival or a tabloid headline. It was the quiet man in the tailored suit with access to their bank accounts. They exploited vulnerability, addiction, family chaos, fame, and even tragedy, everything that made these individuals human, to systematically enrich themselves. Yet, knowing these painful truths does not diminish their stature. It deepens our appreciation for their immense artistic contributions. These stars continued to shine brightly, producing timeless films and unforgettable performances, even while their personal foundations were being systematically destroyed beneath them. They acted through immense financial anxiety, performing for packed theaters while simultaneously dodging tax warrants and bankruptcy filings. That they managed to maintain their poise and creative genius under such duress is perhaps the greatest performance of all. As we close the file on these devastating financial secrets, we are reminded that the golden age of Hollywood was built on the most human of flaws: misplaced trust. Their struggles add necessary depth to their legends, transforming them from untouchable deities into complex, flawed human beings whose resilience in the face of profound personal theft is worthy of honor. The eventual legal consequences for many of these criminal managers were often minimal compared to the wreckage they left behind, further compounding the injustice.